Government Distrust in the 1970s by Jolie Abdelmalek and Madeline Miller.
The 1970s were a decade in which there was a decrease in the trust of the U.S. government, and the overall mood of the American people plummeted. This is because public confidence and trust in the government's ability to solve social and economic problems declined in the 1970s in the wake of economic challenges, political scandals, and foreign policy crises. But why? This overall decrease in trust in government was caused by the Pentagon Papers, the Vietnam War, the Great Inflation of the 1970s, and the Watergate scandal.
This is Daniel Ellsberg. As a military analyst, he was assigned to work on the Pentagon Papers, which essentially detailed the extent of U.S. involvement in Vietnam and had been kept secret. By 1968, Daniel Ellsberg began to oppose the Vietnam War. The Pentagon Papers contained information that the U.S. had expanded the Vietnam War to bombing Cambodia and Laos. He decided that the Pentagon Papers needed to be made available to the public. In 1971, Ellsberg gave the papers to the New York Times. However, in an effort to keep the Pentagon Papers secret, President Nixon ordered a restraining order against the press and said the releasing of the Pentagon Papers was an inhibition of national security, and the New York Times was unable to release the papers. A court case arose about the hindrance of free speech and reached the Supreme Court in a case called New York Times Company versus U.S. In this case, the Supreme Court rules that the government cannot obstruct the press's right to publish information, even if it was classified. The public is outraged that Nixon continued to try and hide the papers from them using the restraining order, thus adding to the growing government distrust.
The Vietnam War was a cause for debate and loss of confidence in the government. When first elected, Nixon promised to end the war with honor. However, he ruled out immediate withdrawal. He hired an independent study to calculate how long they'd be in Vietnam. If they were planning on winning, the study said it would take 8 to 13 years. The fact that he was considering more time in war contributed to government distrust and confidence in the ability to handle foreign crises. As the war continued, so did opposition against government handling of the war, mainly in the form of protests. There were many peaceful protests that were in support of ending the war. College students in particular led this opposition. More than 400 universities had to shut down in response to the protests nationwide. One of the more well-known protests was known as the Kent State Killings, in which 4 protesters were killed by the Ohio National Guard, increasing public distrust of the government. Many more protests followed the killing of the Kent State Four.
With the continuation of the Vietnam War, the expenses led to inflation and, consequently, a fear of recession amongst the people. This inflation fueled more opposition to the war and less confidence in the way the government was handling the economic problems of the 70s.
Another major thing that led to the government distrust was the presidency of Nixon. He was dishonest with the American people and continuously silenced dissent. In an effort to get reelected for his second term, he hired the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP. At 2 a.m. on June 17, 1992, CREEP broke into the Democratic headquarters in Washington at Watergate. The group tries to wiretap the Democratic presidential candidate's office, George McGovern, and the DNC chairman's office, Lawrence O'Brien, in order to gather information on the Democratic Party and how they were handling the election. The CREEP was arrested for the break-in. At first, the break-in didn't seem like it was connected to President Nixon. When asked about it, Nixon denied any connection to CREEP.
In 1972, Nixon was re-elected for his second term after lying to the public. However, an investigation was called. Hearing about this, he asked the FBI to block the investigation. He then ordered a cover-up as he was scared of being exposed for his actions. Nixon's administration attempted to convince the public that he was uninvolved in Watergate and that the crimes were committed without his knowledge. But that backfired when the Watergate tapes were uncovered and proved otherwise. Testimony from a White House aide reveals that there are secret cameras in the White House. He is charged with perjury. When asked to hand over the tapes, which contained proof of Nixon covering up investigations and proof of his involvement in the Watergate scandal, he claimed that releasing them would hurt national security and said that he had the right to withhold the tapes under executive privilege. He is then charged with stonewalling. Congress wanted to dig deeper and hired 7 people to investigate Watergate. Then, the Department of Justice authorized Archibald Cox to conduct investigations with absolutely no interference whatsoever. Cox was able to find solid proof of Nixon's involvement, and Nixon infamously fired him in what was known as the Saturday Night Massacre. He asked U.S. Attorney General Richardson to fire Cox. He refused to do so and resigned in protest. Nixon then went to Ruckelshaus, the acting director of the FBI, to ask him to fire Cox. He also refused and resigned. Eventually, he got Cox fired through Robert Bork, all on the night of Saturday, October 20th, 1973. People were infuriated at this blatant dismissal of evidence, and as a result, distrusted the government even more.
The question of executive privilege is finally answered by the Supreme Court in U.S. v. Nixon, which says that the executive privilege is constitutional, but not at Watergate. The tapes are finally handed in, and there are calls to impeach Nixon due to this high distrust of the federal government and its ability to handle political issues, as it was the one causing them. Nixon resigns on August 8, 1974, and public distrust and doubt of the government and its abilities to handle political, economic, and foreign problems prevails, continuing through the rest of the 1970s. Overall, the Pentagon Papers were a cause for government distrust regarding foreign crises. The Vietnam War resulted in opposition to how the government was handling the war and a decrease in public confidence of the government's ability to deal with foreign crises and social problems as a result of it.
Inflation due to the Vietnam War lessened public trust in how the government was handling economic crisis, and the Watergate crimes led to public indignation and loss of trust in the way the government handled and caused political scandal. Overall, these events led to the annihilation of public faith in the government in the 70s. And that concludes our presentation of government distrust in the 1970s. Thank you for watching.